We next talk about biological and physiological causes that may be diatheses for the development of a disorder. We first think about genes. This karyotype, or purple image on the top of the screen, we call it a karyotype, and it's a representation of the 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get one from mom, one from dad in each pair, and those are, of course, mixed. We don't get exactly the same one mom has or exactly the same one dad has. And we can have things go wrong in there. For an example, we can have deletions, like we're missing a piece that should be in this chromosome, but this particular chromosome in pair 1 is missing it. In pair 2, we could have additions, which is, you can see the chromosome in the first chromosome in pair 2 is as it should be, but we have additional repetitions in the second allele. It's called an allele in that pair of chromosomes. So these are some things that can go wrong just by the process of replication that's happening throughout all of these processes of development. So these can emerge in different conditions. So in the case of Williams syndrome, if we have a deletion, as in pair 1, in a particular chromosome, we have an excess of empathy, love, friendliness, sociability, trust, verbal locatiousness. We have a child who is absolutely a little social master, a storyteller, loving, a delightful child. We do also have cognitive deficits, meaning perhaps intellectual disability, and we may have differences. We do have differences in physical appearance. You can see the elven features in the face, this tilted nose, the big lips, the wide mouth, and certain characteristics like that as well. And that's a deletion at chromosome 7. But if we have an additional repetition at chromosome 7, we have another condition. We have autism spectrum disorder. We have a child with poor communication ability, poor social understanding. So these things that our Williams syndrome child is so very good at, better than any of us are, these are deficient in a child with autism spectrum. This child has little need for social interaction and tends to be focused on objects, not people. Have sensory abnormalities, may interpret, say, heat as a sound or something like that, and may have intellectual deficits, or could possibly, in the case of what we used to call Asperger's syndrome, be intellectually really smart. So not have cognitive deficits, but definitely social deficits. And these are both related to this 7th chromosome pair. A deletion, we have this excessively social, trusting person. And a replication, we have this really deficit in communication ability. Another example of something similar is in the chromosome 15 pair. So we have 2 copies of the chromosome 15, of course, and if we have a problem in the copy that came from the father, we have a condition called Prader-Willi. And if we have a missing section in the chromosome that came from the mother, we have Angelman syndrome. So Angelman syndrome, the problem with the maternal allele, we have a laughter, smiling child. It used to be called happy puppet syndrome. But along with that, we have severe cognitive deficits, very severe mental retardation. I have a nephew with this condition, and he will never talk. He's in his 20s now. He'll never talk, and he'll never walk. And it also affects the production of melanin, so these children tend to be blonde hair and blue-eyed. And that corresponds with the deletion on the maternal allele. And on the other hand, and you can see there's a personality here. If the deletion is on the paternal copy or the paternal allele, we have Prader-Willi syndrome. One characteristic is a child cannot recognize satiation. Like, they can eat and they'll never have a sensation of feeling full. So they can often be obese if they're not monitored by someone. And we also have severe cognitive deficits, this mental retardation, and this child will have difficulty with emotion regulation and anger as well. And that, again, is the deletion on the paternal allele. So you can see here that these genetic abnormalities can form problems for children. We also have heritability, and I don't think I'm talking about it in this slideshow, heritability of mental disorders, so that you may be more susceptible to depression if you inherit a certain gene from a parent who's also had depression. We then have brain function and structure. So we may have underdevelopment of or underfunction of the frontal cortex, which could lead to difficulties with emotional regulation and behavior self-regulation. A child can't control emotions and behavior, and also attention deficit disorder or executive control deficits. We know that serotonin deficiencies are associated with depression, and we know that it's a bidirectional relationship. And we may know that deficiencies in the mirror neuron system may lead to problems interpreting others' intentions or nonverbal signals, such as in autism. Hormonal abnormalities, we have a thyroid gland, for example, that may contribute, and deficiencies in production of that thyroid hormone may contribute to depression. So very often if you go in for depression, they will test your thyroid. We know that if we have chronic overactivation of stress-related production of cortisol and glucocorticoids, we may have anxiety. We know that these are representing the sex hormones, with XY being a typical male, X chromosome from and Y from dad, or XX being a typical female. But if we have something go wrong and we have a child with just XO, we get a particular condition that has, probably this person can't reproduce, but also the abnormalities in physical appearance. And if we have accidentally two X chromosomes and one Y, we get also different characteristics. And these are related to the hormones. Testosterone, which is produced, the release of testosterone is dictated by the Y chromosome. And so we have reductions here in that testosterone up on this end, and estrogen, of course, by the X chromosome. And so we have excessive estrogen in this first case. We know that people are born with a temperament, and we ask, is it shaped by the environment? But we don't know, it's born. And this was done, some work by Thomas Chestenberth, who studied babies for a very long time. They interviewed the parents. They also went into the homes and observed the babies multiple times over their early years. And they looked at emotionality, how big are their emotional responses, activity, how busy are they, sociability, how much do they engage with people, and inhibition, how wary or passive are they, or how hesitant are they to explore. And they understood that there were 3 temperaments through these observations, and that about 40% of the babies they worked with were considered easy. They weren't that emotional, they didn't have big emotional reactions. Their activity level was low, they were calm, they weren't overactive. They were sociable, they liked people, they were positive and cheerful, they would go to a new person and adapt easily. And inhibition was low, they weren't scared, they weren't that fearful. About 10% of babies were difficult, and these were really emotional. They had big, intense reactions. They were hard to soothe. They couldn't soothe themselves well. If they were frustrated, they might get really angry and have a tantrum. They weren't calm, sort of a high activity level. They would be irregular in their nursing needs when they were very young. Their sleep wouldn't be regular. They would be distracted. They're not the calm kind of baby who's relaxed. Their sociability was low. They would be maybe mostly not smiling, but fretful or negative. And they wouldn't easily adapt to a new environment, so it would be hard to go visit grandma. Sorry for the error on this slide here. And they would be inhibited, like they wouldn't go up to new stimuli. They wouldn't approach things very well. They would be slow if there's a change in routine, slow to accept new foods. And difficult infants do not turn into difficult adults. But there isn't, so if you were a difficult infant, don't worry. Or if you have a difficult child. But it is hard on the parents. And so this difficult child can impact parenting, and it's easy for parents to blame themselves. And so you want to just For those early days, you just want to give them a calm, steady environment and try and not introduce a lot of change. Let them get used to their body that they're in before introducing them to a lot of new things. And finally, slow to warm includes about 15% of children. And here we don't have a lot of high emotionality. This isn't a really reactive child. And we get, regular eating and sleeping. They're not overactive, but they're not that sociable. Like, they're not upset like the difficult child, but they're more serious. Like just looking with those big eyes kind of intently at you. And so they're not that sociable. They're not like embracing everybody around them. They're just holding back, and they tend to be inhibited. So when there's something new, they hold back maybe for a long time. It's like you go to the park and with this child, and maybe finally at the very end of your time at your park, your slow to warm child is ready to go play. But again, we can be patient with those children. Now we might have amidst these temperaments a mismatch. And so we have this heredity. Kagan links it to a physiological model, and he says, well, he's looking just at inhibited here, which is part of that last characteristic we looked at, and he says some infants are more inhibited than others. And so if a child is inhibited, that means that their amygdala or their emotional activation is high. So they're, and norepinephrine, which is like adrenaline, which is making them feel aroused, is high. And this is all part of their sympathetic nervous system. So they just have an active sympathetic nervous system, and that leads them to have an inhibited temperament. So what can the parents do? Well, if the parent overprotects the child, looking at the white box on the top of the screen, the child may never develop the skills that they need. They might be unassertive, they might be depressed, they might never learn that it'll be okay to go into that situation. A parent needs to just be present with the child, showing that it's okay long enough for their parasympathetic system to slow down all those responses. And then the child can go explore. And so if the child is encouraged to explore, their parent is calm and maybe lets them sit a little bit longer, then we can have a well-adapted personality. On the other hand, if a child has really low sympathetic activation, that means that whatever they're facing, their body isn't telling them it's an emergency. So then we might have an uninhibited temperament. They're not afraid. They're not afraid of punishment. They're not afraid of any rules. They're not afraid of getting in trouble. Well, this could be challenging. For the child in the inhibited temperament, if they're doing something they shouldn't, you can just say, oh, don't do that, or oops, that's not a good idea, and that child will stop the behavior. But if it's uninhibited, the child isn't going to stop the behavior because they're not getting any responses that it's problematic. And so this child, I don't like the way this model presents it, strict discipline, which suggests that maybe you should beat this child. That's never the case. What it means is that you need to have firm guidelines and you need to firmly put them in place. And so there can't be ambiguity. A light touch, let's say I used that word touch and I didn't mean it. Probably they need to have just sort of a firm hand. Yes, you will do this. And then they can grow into a well-adapted personality. But if not, if the discipline is lax and they're allowed to do whatever they want and they have this fearless personality, well, then they're going to maybe come out as aggressive or antisocial. And so we want to keep all of this in mind as we think about the relationship between parenting and temperament. We also think about genes and then the actual expression of those genes. So we have the gene itself, the genotype. This is an allele that is replicating itself, the gene, what you're actually born with, and then what's actually expressed. And so what do we see on the outside? So you have a gene for a certain characteristic, but is that what we see? And we can look at this as happening on a continuum. So genes and environment determine what's going to be expressed for most multi-gene characteristics. So imagine here this continuum, the shyest possible human ever. Let's just imagine that this is the possibility for humans versus the least shy human ever. We're looking at the characteristic of shyness. Excuse me. And so let's say the person's genotype is right here. They're kind of in the middle of the continuum. Well, this can go two ways. That doesn't mean they're going to be exactly that shy. Their phenotype could be anywhere in here. Maybe. They probably, if they have this shyness, they're probably never going to be way up here. They're never going to be way down here, but there's a range of possibilities. And that depends on what the parents are doing. So if there's a lot of early touch-based care, they feel confident, they feel they're encouraged to go explore. Their mother and father help them to navigate the environment. Well, they can be less shy. But if the parent is very, very shy, and every time the child feels shy, the parent reinforces it and strengthens that trait and says, yeah, that's scary, you don't need to do that, then we're going to have more of a shy individual. And that's true for other traits as well. And so then that brings us to looking at this correlation between genes and environment. So let's say, this is what we find. This is a correlation. If you take an individual, you measure what their genes are for, say, outgoingness, and then you look at how often they're in an outgoing environment, you find a correlation. Lower genes for outgoingness, lower times in an outgoing environment. High genes for outgoingness, lots of time in an outgoing environment. But why is this? So there are three mechanisms: gene-environment correlation. One is passive. And so an outgoing parent, a child is born into a home, and they're getting their traits from their parent. And so if the parent has a trait of outgoingness, then the parent is just going to provide that for the child. And passive, if the parent is quiet, they're going to provide a quiet environment. Then we have active mechanisms that people make choices within their environment. They pick their niches. And so if it's an active gene-environment correlation, then this outgoing child is going to seek outgoing. When they're in kindergarten, they have a choice of what to do. They're going to pick something social. And when they're at recess, they're going to pick something social. Whereas the quiet child is going to seek a quiet environment and choose the activities maybe that are quiet and solitary. And finally, an evocative, children receive responses from others that are influenced by their genotype and interpret them differently. What this means, in another way of saying it, is that a child will bring out behaviors in another. So we're going to impact other people. So if I'm a really outgoing child, this one, well, look at the impact I'm having on these kids. Now they are feeling more social and laughy and outgoing. Well, I've evoked outgoing behavior in others. So now I've sort of created my own outgoing environment. Whereas this quiet child, well, if there are other children around, they're not likely to be jumping up and screaming. This child, when he gets together with friends, may be saying, let's do this, and it will be a quieter thing. Or maybe just will tend to be more quiet, and so the other children will do so as well. So these are just examples of how the phenotype is shaped and these three mechanisms. So there's a lot more to it, but this is a little overview. We talked about genetic and chromosomal abnormalities, and I didn't talk as much about heredity. We talked about temperament and Kagan's model, explaining it from a physiological perspective. We talked about neurotransmitter anomalies such as serotonin. We talked about hormonal anomalies such as the sex hormones, and we talked about gene and environment correlations.